Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. All right, folks, this week it's time for the Rendezvous, our monthly look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. when it comes to air and space power, plus important national security trends we should be watching around the globe. So we're recording this on Monday, February 2nd, so if world events have developed since then, we'll catch that on the next episode. And with that, I'd like to welcome Sledge Harmer. Sledge.
Great to be back.
Laser Lazarski. Laser.
Happy Groundhog Day.
Yeah, no kidding. And we are going to have another 6 weeks of winter. Jeff Rowley-Rollison.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. And those are our Washington regulars. We've also got Joel Deptula.
Hey, good afternoon.
Jay Dahm, Mike Dahm.
Hi, Heather. How you been?
And Jen Reeves, Boots of our Winchell team.
So happy to be here. Highlight of my week.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for making it. All right. So, as usual, we're going to start off with the Washington update. So, Laser, Sledge, and Jeff. We're going to begin with that congressional update. As of February 2nd, the U.S. DoD, Department of Defense, is in a state of temporary funding uncertainty following a narrowly missed shutdown deadline. While the Senate passed an $838.7 billion defense bill for fiscal year 26 on the 30th, a lapse in funding is expected because the House is not in session to approve the final package until early this week. So can you walk us through all of that, and what are some of the key things that we should note?
Yeah, I'm still optimistic, and I think both Sledge and I were optimistic as we were going through that we'd get at least 9 of the 12 appropriations bills before the end of the continuing resolution on the 30th of January. And then the ones we were worried about were state and foreign ops, financial services, and lo and behold, Homeland Security, which is the one that's giving us problem right now. But if you look, both defense appropriation and labor, health and human services, they're linked together. Obviously, the largest spending out of all the bills, and they're in good shape. But what happened is the House actually passed 12 appropriations bills. All 12 of them came out on the 22nd, the last 6. And they did Homeland on its own. But because of events in Minneapolis, the Senate pulled Homeland Security out. And what they did is they voted on 5 of the 6 with, full year appropriations. And then they put the Homeland Security on a 2-week continuing resolution. And that's going to expire on the 13th of February. So the rest of the 5 appropriations bills are great. They've been sent over to the House today, the 2nd of February at 4 p.m. The House Rules Committee is going to meet, and nothing is a given, but what we're hearing is it will most likely pass rules, but it's going to pass on a partisan basis. So all the Republicans are going to need to vote for it because the Democrats say that, this is for the Republicans to pass. Not all Republicans love the way this is coming over, but I expect the president has come out in support. So I expect that there are certain people that are going to be getting calls to make sure that they can pass the rules. And that just sets up what goes on the floor and then the floor debate. And I am hearing it could get delayed, but we're hearing Tuesday is when hopefully we will get the 5 appropriations bills with the 1 continuing resolution on Homeland Security done. So that's great. And then on defense appropriations, it's a good bill. $8.4 billion increase. There's a salary increase. We've got increase in personnel, not huge for air and space forces, and then a bunch of aircraft. So, I think we're going to be in good shape. I think we'll have it done. And then one last comment, reconciliation bill. We've talked about this in past. $150 billion, right? And they put out a spend plan for 89, and they said they were going to spend 113 in FY26. They haven't allocated most of the money, actually hardly any of the money, which is impacting our efforts to modernize or get munitions or fix the supply chain. So one of the things that I'm hearing is that they need OMB to get the funding allocated so we can start using that funding.
So let's talk about that for a minute. OMB. OMB has not allocated the funding. What does that mean?
That means that we had the one big, beautiful bill, the reconciliation bill, and the money went over to defense. And Congress gave them their intent on what, they wanted this money to spend for, was the authorizers essentially put this together. And then now OMB has the money. They just need to start giving it to the services down to the program so they can start executing. I mean, I know that the Golden Dome, I know that JIADF 401, I know that they have plans on how they want to execute this funding, but they're waiting for the funding to come down. And we were hearing even the rest of the spend plans were supposed to come out at the end of January, and they haven't seen the end of those spend plans. And the other thing is, as you're trying to put these in this next budget together, Congress wants to know what money was spent by DOD where so that they can build this next budget.
Yeah, and it's kind of problematic because even though we had a budget last year, and of course reconciliation we're still waiting for that funding to come down. Last year, they didn't even publish a FYDP. So in terms of future years' defense spending, there was no projection on what they would then do, not just within the regular baseline budget, but then how reconciliation would adjust that spending plan going forward.
No, you're exactly right. And the whole point is, we're going to talk about this later, 1.5 trillion. It's not just about 1 year, but it's how we have sufficient and predictable budgets in the future.
I think Laser captured it all pretty well there. I guess I'll just go back. Hopefully, by the time this podcast airs, the government's back open with approach for the Defense Department and a short-term CR for DHS while Congress figures out how they're going to handle or modify the authorities that the CBP and ICE have. But there is really no appetite on Capitol Hill for a shutdown right now. This is kind of unfortunate. It feels weird right now that it's not really a shutdown, but everybody wants to get FY26 in the rearview mirror. They want to move on to, is there going to be another reconciliation bill? Let's move to FY27 so we can do that. Every day that goes by complicates the congressional consideration of a FY27 budget request, but it also makes it problematic for the programmers in the Pentagon to put together a meaningful budget that includes or captures previous reconciliation funding, that captures what the FY27, 28 PALM and BES look like, and then provides the FYDP information that Laser mentioned. So Congress can figure out, okay, we've got to check the math that the department's doing, but it's just, there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. It's really, really hard to keep track of what's going on now.
Yeah, and without having that funding from last year's reconciliation released to the department so that the different services can spend it, it's really hard for me to imagine how do programmers adapt to that? How do they figure out how to manage?
Here's a great example. If you look in the funding table for the F-15EX and the Defense Appropriations Bill, it says zero, no money.
Yeah.
But you look, there's a column that they penciled in called mandatory, and it has $3.2 billion. So reconciliation funded a whole bunch of F-15EXs. You don't know how many, but there's also a comment that says in the appropriations bill that they added an additional aircraft. So really, it just makes it hard to keep track of what's going on and come up with a meaningful plan to support the national defense strategy.
Yeah, and if you're an industry, if you're a supplier, all of this creates additional uncertainty in how you manage your workforce and how you manage your production lines. Raleigh, what do you got from us from the space side? How are they looking at this?
So it's interesting, Sledge just mentioned that mandatory column that's in the joint explanatory statement. If you pull the Space Force's 26 RDT&E budget and all the marks that went into there's exactly $0 in the reconciliation column, in that mandatory column. So a lot of still ambiguity in how our Space Force is going to be able to leverage the available reconciliation funding that was supposed to have been allocated to it, even on the RDT&E side. So still a lot to be answered. Like Laser said, when Comptroller and OMB kind of get on the same page and send those spend plans over, I think you will start to get some clarity moving forward.
Yeah, as we've already talked about the word that there's going to be a budget boost for FY27, and we've heard the president announce that he wants to see that $1.5 trillion defense budget for 27. Joan Deptula, you recently wrote a detailed article in Forbes Aerospace and Defense Business section on this. Talk to us about the key considerations with this kind of increase to the DOW top line.
Well, a 1.5 trillion defense top line in 27 is certainly a big number. But what I tell folks is the real issue isn't the size of the budget, it's whether DoD/W translates that money into real military power. I know this crowd understands this, but it needs to be said over and over again that the United States faces or is facing the most complex and capable set of threats in its entire history. And that's across multiple theaters and simultaneously. Yet our Air Force is the smallest and oldest it's ever been, and our Space Force, despite being indispensable to every joint operation, remains dramatically under-resourced. So that mismatch between global demand and military capacity is the core problem that this budget increase must address. Now, for the Department of the Air Force in particular, this is about reversing 3 decades of underfunding. The result of that, well, since Desert Storm, that we just celebrated the 35th anniversary of the start of, the Air Force has been cut to less than half the combat size it had at that time, while the average age of the fleet continues to climb to new levels. Just a quick reminder to our audience, the Air Force has over 10 different types of aircraft that today make up over 2/3 of our total aircraft inventory, over 2,600 aircraft that first flew over 50 years ago. To put that in comparison, the Navy has only 1 ship that's over 50 years old. That's a ratio of 2,600 to 1. Yet the Navy is already getting huge plus-ups for shipbuilding and even has a special office in the White House to oversee that buildup. Then there's readiness. Readiness has suffered through this. Pilots aren't flying enough. Maintainers are struggling to keep aging aircraft operational. And on any given day, there are over 700 Air Force aircraft that are grounded due to spare part shortages. Folks, this is not sustainable as a foundation for deterrence. So, what does all that mean? It means that a higher top line gives us the opportunity to fix that, but only if it's sustained and focused. One-time budget spikes don't rebuild forces. What matters is a multi-year re-leveling that allows us to expand aircraft and munitions production, restore readiness, and accelerate modernization that's already in progress. Look, the production lines exist today: B-21, F-35, F-15EX, tankers, E-7 even, collaborative combat aircraft. With increase in stable funding, we can scale those production lines to rebuild necessary capacity instead of continuing the decline of Air Force force structure, which, by the way, is the path that we're headed down today. Space is the other critical piece. Every U.S. military operation depends on space systems for a variety of different reasons. And guess what? China and Russia understand that. So they're building capabilities specifically designed to hold our space systems at risk. Yet the Space Force operates with roughly only 3% of the defense budget and fewer than 10,000 uniformed personnel, which is about 20% of the people on one Army base. That imbalance has got to change if we expect space superiority to be real rather than aspirational. Finally, we've got to be clear-eyed about execution. The Department of Defense/War and the industrial base can absorb this level of investment, but only if Congress and the President send clear, predictable, multi-year demand signals. Industry will respond when it sees sustained commitment, not continued uncertainty. So the bottom line is this: a $1.5 trillion defense budget isn't excessive when viewed in historical terms as a share of GDP. We're spending the least on defense and GDP in our entire history since World War II. But it will only matter if it rebuilds air and space power, which are the foundation of global vigilance, global reach, and global power that allows us to deter aggression, protect the homeland, and win if deterrence fails. So, thanks for the question. For more details on the topic, I encourage your audience to read my article in Forbes that's entitled "A $1.5 trillion defense budget: Implications for the Air Force and the Space Force."
We'll include a link to that in our show notes. Now, Boots, you worked in depth for the Air Force budget for many years. You're down deep in the engine room. Can you take us through the details at a more operational level of what the consequences of this kind of impact could mean? Because we're just hearing about it in the press, but we've not actually seen any dollars. We've not seen any speculation regarding how much each service would receive. But in terms of the drills that you go through, talk us through all of that.
Okay, so now I'm not inside this cycle in the engine room, so I'm starting with a tiny alibi, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the generic cycle looks like and why this is so important. What ends up happening is I like to say that every level of the government for a services budget gets to approve and grade the homework, if you will. So what ends up happening is OSD CAPE, OSD Comptroller, OMB, both houses of Congress, every single person along this line, they all have input into a services budget. Okay. And the service must address all of the feedback, every single line of feedback that comes from all of these agencies. So the budget's going to go from the POM, turns into a BES, turns into a president's budget, and then eventually enacted and appropriated. Then it gets to come back. And oh, by the way, what I just said in 3 seconds takes months and months to happen, many months, most of a year, actually.
Well, and we haven't seen it done that. We haven't seen it done on schedule for a long time either, right? So,
it's very rare that it happens. And I believe the president's budget is supposed to be delivered to the Congress it's like on a first Tuesday in February kind of thing. And we rarely see that happen. And then who knows how long the Congress takes to actually enact and appropriate it. Yes, it's a very thorough process, but it ticks all of the sort of the constitutional requirements by doing it this way, from what I understand. When it comes back and there is actually an enacted and an appropriated budget, okay, that's when, the colonels and the majors in the basement of the Pentagon really get to work to go heads down and take the volumes of funds that have been allocated into the particular program elements and make sure that that money is there at the right time. So then the program managers out in the world of the various services can then go spend that money on what it has been allocated to by law. And it gets very difficult. We were talking about this process, about how the budget gets built initially. And like we've said, it takes last year's budget to write this year's budget. I can't begin to let people know how enormous $1 trillion is, or $850 billion, whatever it happens to be. It's such a mind-boggling, unimaginable amount of money that the services have to budget down to the penny. And so how we do this is we start with last year's budget. And the implication of starting with last year's budget every year is that the money has to be continuous in some way. Because if you zero something out in the middle, then you've lost the funding in a particular year to be able to keep production lines open, to be able to keep skilled labor and workforce at the ready, and actually
supply
building
chains
what
continuing.
is we need. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's devastating if we have breaks in the budget. And I'm anxiously awaiting that the teams in the Pentagon are going to be able to get after it.
So
if
OMB has not released the funding to the services from last year's reconciliation, how does that then impact the services' ability to then plan for and even ingest and program 1.5?
Well, it gets very, very challenging because it gets physically hard to allocate the money, literally to do the paperwork as it gets crunched up with less and less time to do it by the end of the fiscal year at the end of September. And literally what's happening is finance folks and program managers are spending all-nighters to try and spend the money that the Congress told them to spend, but then they didn't tell them in a timely enough way such that now they're all sitting there for a month of all-nighters to try and get it done before the end of the actual execution year.
So, Sledge Laser and Raleigh, what's Congress's reaction to all this press about a $1.5 trillion budget?
That's a great question, Lucky. I think they've been so focused on 26, you don't hear a lot. But I would say in general, it's the waterfront is covered here. You've got some elements of the Congress that think we spend way too much on defense, and we need to spend more on non-defense discretionary, more of the butter part of the guns and butter equation. But I think the people that work and live in the national security environment realize, as General Deptula said earlier, we're at historical levels in terms of the low end of GDP that we're spending on defense, that there is a need to increase defense spending. We're asking way too much of the department, and we're providing too few of the resources.
Yeah, I agree with Sledge. I'm looking at what's going on in Congress, even with all their focus on 26. When that 1.5 trillion came out, it polarized everybody. You have defense hawks, and then you have debt hawks. Then there's even a defense spending reduction caucus that's led by Representative Omar and Pocan, and both of them, slammed the budget, and they were really going after the audit. But the big question for everyone is, and again, I was talking about, okay, we have non-defense and defense spending, and as Sledge knows, they always want parity. If you bring up defense, they want parity in non-defense, and we're not going to bring non-defense up that much. And then how does that impact our debt, right? So that's everything that's going on. My concern is if a $1.5 trillion budget comes over from the president, it needs 60 votes in the Senate. How do I get 60 votes in the Senate? So then, okay, maybe we only get $1 trillion. Then where does that other $500 billion go? Is it an emergency supplemental? Does it come out of tariffs? Is it another reconciliation bill? I mean, the last one, we only got 50 billion, not 500. So I just think, while there's a lot of support, I mean, Rogers and Wicker, both chairs of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, said that this is great. It's going to address the threats, and this is what we need to do to rebuild our military. I just don't know how we're going to get it passed in Congress.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From
Do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
to
He has your eyes. He's perfect.
learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, General Deptula, the Department of War recently issued a new national defense strategy, and you've been through 10 administrations worth of these NDSs since you entered the Air Force. So I'd like to start with your perspectives on what, when you read this new national defense strategy, what are your thoughts?
Well, Heather, having lived through those 10 administrations worth of national defense strategies, what jumps out to me about the 2026 version is not continuity, but a clear change in direction. First, the priority order has shifted. Unlike the 2022 era strategy, which put China as a pacing challenge and emphasized integrated deterrence with allies across theaters, the 2026 NDS puts homeland and Western Hemisphere defense first. Border and maritime approaches, counter UAVs, and what's now being called Golden Dome, a comprehensive integrated air and missile defense of U.S. territory. Now, that said, deterring China remains critical, but it's now second in the order of effort. That's a meaningful strategic signal because priorities, not words, drive force design and budgets. Second, the way the strategy frames deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is sharpened. The 2026 NDS explicitly calls for a denial defense along the first island chain. That's important because deterrence by denial is air power intensive. It does require projecting power, generating combat sorties under attack, dispersing forces, sustaining ops from austere locations, moving large volumes of munitions, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the strategy aligns well with what PACAF and the Air Force have been organizing around for years. Agile combat employment, contested command and control, and distributed operations. Third, the alliance model has become more conditional. The strategy is very direct that allies and partners must carry more of the load, with the U.S. providing critical but more limited support in some regions. That's a shift from the earlier emphasis on allied campaigning as an enduring U.S. strength. Now, whether that works depends heavily on how quickly partners actually build capacity and whether U.S. forces are sized to cover the gap if they don't. Fourth, and this might be the most consequential change, the National Defense Strategy elevates industrial capacity to a strategic line of effort. It explicitly links deterrence and warfighting readiness to production scale, munitions throughput, spares, repairables, and even allied manufacturing. That's significant because the biggest constraint on more air power today isn't ideas or technology, it's production and sustainment capacity. From an Air Force perspective, the net effect is mixed but potentially powerful. The strategy strengthens the case for Pacific relevant air power mass and resiliency. But putting homeland defense first also creates a real budget and attention conundrum. Counter UAV, air and missile defense, and hemispheric missions are Air Force heavy for sure. But if top lines don't rise enough, those demands won't be able to be met. So the strategy's success will hinge on execution. Best case, it delivers more combat credible air power by fixing the industrial base and enabling defense denial, or denial defense in the case of the China theater. The risk case, it becomes more missions without more force. As always, strategy without aligned resources and sustained follow-through is just rhetoric.
Yeah, I think your emphasis on the need to actually recapitalize the Air Force as a result of that industrial capacity is crucial. And unfortunately, the only way you get that is through dollars and sustained and predictable dollars. So,
yeah, no, I just want to emphasize that we're beyond the era of doing more with less.
Yeah.
We're down to the bottom of that barrel. It's just less and less and less.
And research and development isn't going to fix you out of this.
to be squared out of the system either.
Yeah. And research and development isn't going to fix you out of this. You've got to buy what's in production now. And so the list of major weapon systems that you discussed, whether or not it's E-7, F-35, F-15EX, EA-37B, all of those things we've got to be able to buy. So pivoting here to how our adversaries around the globe might be looking at this new national defense strategy, Dahm, put your China hat on. What's your take?
Well, I think we're really missing the boat on the national defense strategy. I think the strategic context is way off, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of I'm sure there is a lot of celebration and glee in Beijing over the national defense strategy, to be quite frank with you.
Why is that?
So I think General Deptula said that the national defense strategy is a significant change in direction. I would observe that the only difference between a landing and a crash when you are descending is rate of change. More rate of change can sometimes result in unwanted consequences. But I think what resonates throughout the national defense strategy, and even what General Deptula was talking about, with all respect, was deterring China. And I think we talk about deterring them from what? The obvious answer is, deterring them from taking Taiwan. We don't want them to take Taiwan. But I think there's a larger situation at play here, that the United States is the status quo power, and China has seen U.S. power declining over the last several decades. And China basically wants to supplant the United States as the status quo power. So I'm channeling General Mattis here, our former Secretary of Defense. The enemy gets a vote. We want everything to stay the same. We want to remain the status quo power, and we want to deter China from initiating any kind of change, especially irreversible change. But if you look at Chinese strategy, and they just released their own national security strategy, I guess it was in November. You would be forgiven for having missed it. And it's not a defense strategy. It doesn't say a whole lot about military power, but it does talk about Chinese national security. And it uses this phrase, great changes that have not been seen in a century. That is the context within which Chinese strategy is happening. And that phrase, great changes that have not been seen in a century, shows up in Xi Jinping's speeches. It shows up in policy documents. And
so when they're talking about that, they're really talking about changing that power, the global power dynamic.
Yeah, it's not just great changes that have not been seen in a century is not just about there's a lot going on in the world. They're saying that this global system that has been created and dominated by Western powers since the beginning of the last century, and especially since the end of the Second World War, is entering structural decline. Meanwhile, China, in their view, is experiencing a historic window of opportunity to resume what Xi Jinping has called China's rightful place in the world. So there's this ongoing rebalancing of global power toward non-Western states that could be led by China, and a once-in-a-century opportunity for China to reshape the international order. So it's not about Taiwan. It's not about making this change over whose flag is flying over Taipei in the Western Pacific. There is a much greater game at play. And so what is our response to that? What is the national defense strategy's response to what is, I have outlined here as the Chinese strategy? Well, we're going to withdraw to the Western Hemisphere. Are we ceding ground to China when we do that? We're going to deter China in the Indo-Pacific specifically through strength and not confrontation. Well, how are we doing that? We don't want to be confrontational with China. What if China wants to be confrontational with us? Are we going to be prepared to be confrontational back?
And oh, by the way, China's just not thinking about just Taiwan. They're thinking about global presence.
Exactly. We talk about this holding the line at the first island chain. I don't really understand what that means. We're going to have this strong denial defense along the first island chain that General Deptula was talking about. How are we going to do that? What is it about this first island chain strategy? Is this a containment strategy? Are we back to the Cold War now, where I've just outlined this strategy that China has to expand its influence worldwide? So we're gonna hold the line at the first island chain. Is it about Taiwan? Because Taiwan, that name does not show up in the national defense strategy at all. So if China sees this as a once-in-a-century opportunity to reshape the world and expand, what are we doing about that? And if this strategy is just focused on Taiwan, this hold the line on the first island chain, do we have sanctuary? Or do we think we're going to initiate this denial defense from sanctuary in Guam, sanctuary along the first island chain? And if we really are concerned with threats to the homeland, are we going to allow China that sanctuary? Are we going to allow them to launch an attack against Taiwan and just deny them that objective from some sort of sanctuary?
Well, realistically, when we look at this, for kind of what I'm saying is clearly we need to ensure that we have security for the homeland. But the focus on the Western Hemisphere, and we probably neglected the Western Hemisphere for too long.
But so I'm going to challenge you on that too. Can somebody outline for me what the military threats are that are emanating from the Western Hemisphere right now? I think we have some national security concerns in the Western Hemisphere, but if China's eating our lunch in the Western Hemisphere, they're doing it economically, they're doing it diplomatically, they're doing it informationally. So now we're getting into this academic geopolitical discussion of can you balance Chinese influence diplomatically, economically, especially economically and informationally, with the military lever of power in the Western Hemisphere? Is that the right way to apply U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere to ensure U.S. national security? It's an open
you interrupted
question,
me before I got the chance to finish, because I do agree with you. I don't know that the military is really the right implement to be able to use across the entire Western Hemisphere. But I do think from a national security standpoint, we have neglected it with respect to the other instruments that we have available, the informational, the economic, and diplomatic. And that said, if there's a holdback for homeland defense, that prevents us, because we are too small, from being able to execute any kind of strategy, denial or not, within the Indo-Pacific. And I would argue, even if we were free to be able to do that, a strategy of denial wouldn't necessarily be successful because we are too small to be able to endure and enforce that denial.
Yeah, and we've had that conversation here at Mitchell about are we playing this catcher's mitt game where Golden Dome and homeland defense become basically we're just trying to catch all the inbound threats without taking the fight to the advisor, whether it's China, Russia, or anywhere else.
Yeah.
So, let me jump in there, JM. I think a lot of your points that you made are valid, but the last point I think is extraordinarily important. that is not directly mentioned in the NDS, but I think it's enduring, and that's exactly what you said. The best way to deal with homeland defense is to deter our adversaries from shooting at us in the first place. You don't have to play catcher's mitt with all of those missiles and incoming warheads. And that means to have a sufficient power projection force that induces enough uncertainty in their minds that they might have their homelands attacked and might be defeated if they were so arrogant to launch an assault on the United States. That's not there, but it's an enduring point. I think all your critiques of the strategy are valid.
They're having the same discussion that you guys just had on the Hill, and it's a mixed response, and it's not necessarily party lines, but it's a little bit on party lines. So areas of agreement, some of this you discuss, deterrence, rebuilding the industrial base, improving supply chain, and working with partners. And there's two pieces to this, but working with partners to include burden sharing, deterring China. You talked about that, but what is that? Focus on Arctic, increase cooperation, Middle East, cyber, air defense. Now, where they're disagreeing, and Schumer had said, he said the strategy calling it America First shift is a retreat from global responsibilities and a danger to domestic safety. So where people disagree, they're calling it an isolationist strategy. It abandons allies and partners, signals force structure cuts in Europe, Indo-Pacific to include the Korean Peninsula. It's giving up the away game, which you guys were talking about. And then it's saying it lacks details, although others are saying that the lack of details is actually intentional. And then the inability to execute due to force structure and funding. And then the only other thing is the pivot. How many times have we tried to pivot from out in the Middle East over to the Pacific? We're a global country. I mean, we have to be everywhere, and we don't have the force structure. So trying to pivot and move things around, there's people not sure how they're going to get this done.
Shifting topics. Mitchell Institute just hosted our annual Air Force Air Power Forum, and kudos to Doug Birkey for putting all of this together. It really was a heavy lift, and the entire ops team here at Mitchell did a fantastic job because they got an all-star lineup of top Air Force leaders. We had General Spain of Air Combat Command. We had Lieutenant General Armagos, the Vice Commander of Global Strike Command, Lieutenant General Harris, the A57, Lieutenant General Ployce, the Acting Vice Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Cunningham, the A3, Lieutenant General Bell, the A4, Brigadier General Bartolome, the head of AFRL, and a number of industry leaders. So it was a fantastic day. And I know most of you attended, so I'd like to get your top takes. John Deptula, you set the agenda and hosted the event. So let's start with your rationale and your impressions of the outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. The rationale for this Mitchell Institute Air Power Forum is pretty straightforward. We wanted to create a venue where senior Air Force leaders and industry could have an honest, substantive discussion about how to build more combat credible air power, not in theory, but in practice. Too often these conversations happen in stovepipes. Operators talk to operators, acquirers to acquirers, and industry hears filtered requirements after decisions are already locked in. So the forum was designed to break that pattern and focus on the full chain, from strategy and force design to readiness, acquisition, sustainment, and industrial capacity. Now, what stood out to me was the level of alignment across very different parts of the Air Force, whether it was Air Combat Command, Global Strike Command, the A Staff, or AFRL. There was a consistent message. Demand is growing faster than capacity, and the Air Force cannot meet future requirements by managing decline more efficiently. We need to rebuild force structure, restore readiness, and accelerate modernization simultaneously. Now, another key takeaway was how central execution has become. Leaders were very clear that concepts like ACE, contested logistics, and resilient C2 are no longer experimental. They're operational necessities. But turning those concepts into reality requires predictable funding, faster acquisition timelines, and an industrial base that can produce at scale. Finally, the dialogue with industry was exactly what we'd hoped for. There was a shared recognition that industry will respond to clear, sustained demand signals, but not to uncertainty or one-year spikes. So if we want more air power, we have to align strategy, budgets, and production over time. So overall, I think the forum reinforced that the Air Force understands the problem pretty clearly. The question now is whether the broader defense enterprise follows through with the resources and the decisions that's needed to solve them.
And the sustained resources that has been bumped up. So we can get, for example, those multi-year procurements that we've been talking about that not only provide savings to the department, increased production quantities, but the stability that industry needs to be able to achieve that kind of health. It just all comes down to the dollars. Gentlemen, what did you see?
Midnight Hammer. Great team, great planning, listening to lessons learned. A lot of us, General Deptula, Sledge, we've learned those lessons. It's interesting to watch how we relearn lessons as new people go in and do these large exercises, or large operations. But great job. This was interesting because I always want to be in the aircraft flying, but the importance of joint simulation environment and live virtual constructive training, because we can't do what we need to do just by flying. I mean, besides not having the forces, but we don't want our enemies to know what we're doing. And the most important, and again, I had to hear it from our leadership, is the fly, fix, fight. And I've always understood the importance of readiness and our ability to generate combat power, but I've always been, at least recently, been focused on modernization and rebuilding the force. And again, listening to our Air Force leadership, we're not abandoning modernization, but you deter and fight with the force you have. We've said this repeatedly, and the current readiness rates is inadequate to accomplish both of those missions. So if we increase from 67% to over 80%, we'll immediately increase the size of our force. General Deptula, you were talking about that earlier. And then we can also provide more aircraft to train our air crews, because, right, we just reached 1,500 trained pilots, and I can't absorb them into the fighter community because I don't have enough jets flying. And the bottom line is, and I hated just-in-time logistics. We all knew it wasn't going to work. But it's going to take a long, I would say, I don't know. I mean, I'll ask people here, how long is it going to take to get the supply chain fixed? I mean, we can throw an influx of funding in there, but I've got to get all the spare parts made and get them out before I can start increasing readiness.
Well, and that's assuming that the spare parts are still available, that those suppliers are still alive, because given how old so many of our airplanes are, there are diminishing manufacturing sources. So those parts aren't even made anymore. And I totally see what you're saying there. We don't have enough cockpits because we don't have the aircraft availability. They might be sitting on the ramp, but they're broken, so we can't fly them, so we can't absorb them, and then we can't fight with them. But I will tell you, it's because the aircraft are so old. And if we're able to buy new aircraft, availability rates would go up dramatically. Yes, all of those. And Sledge, what do you got?
No, I was just going to make a couple general observations, but first, kind of a rhetorical jest that I used to use. Laser, how long does it take to build a 10-year, 9-level maintenance guy? Well, it takes you about 10 years. So it's going to take sustained investment and spare parts. Our S rates have got to go up. I totally agree. And the one point that I think the A4 missed during the forum was it's expensive to maintain old airplanes, but if you buy new airplanes, you don't have to spend as much on spare parts. So there's a cost curve that you've got to break there. But in general, I thought the topics were incredibly relevant. I thought the speakers were outstanding. And my big takeaway was I looked at my watch and go, holy cow, the day is over. That, to me, was the sign of a good event. No. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, kudos to Doug and the ops team for that. So the Department of the Air Force, so the Air Force and Space Force, so we've got a new round of program management and acquisition reforms. I'd like to hear from y'all. What are your thoughts on this from the Air Force and from the Space Force side? Raleigh, you want to jump in? We haven't heard your voice for a while.
Yeah, you're not missing much. Hey, so the interesting thing about the PAE announcements coming from the DAF or the two that the Space Force started with, right? And that's space access and space-based sensing and targeting. And I think identifying those sets the tone going forward. Expect to see more announced, hopefully, by the end of the month, we'll get the full picture of how that PAE architecture is starting to lay in. Really interested to see where that space control, space superiority mission falls and how that's defined going forward. But I think we've got 2 PAEs and they're off and running.
I think only time will tell whether this is another movement of deck chairs or if it actually achieves the holy grail of acquisition reform. However, given the focus by Secretary Hegseth and Congress, as we've seen, on specifically acquisition and warfighting, I'm actually cautiously optimistic, but it's going to take years to accomplish. I love the transitioning to a warfighting acquisition system. I love the fact that we're going to have more authority to make more important decisions so we can speed up the procurement process. And then Secretary Hegseth talked about risk adversity, but he was talking about industry. But we know that within our own service, we are risk adverse. So how do we get past that so that we can move forward? But I think the portfolios, I think everything on there, the commercial first mindset, I think that's great. So I'll stay and get rid of JSIDs. That's a good thing. So
Yeah, I think everyone thinks that's a good thing.
So there's some good stuff out there, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I'm Laser. I'm also optimistic, but I disagree. I don't not really disagree, but I do not see this as a reorganizing the deck chairs for a couple things. I think this is a structural overhaul of the acquisition system. There's 4 things that are required to get a government contract. You have to have a requirement. There's some type of an acquisition process. There has to be funding available. And then because there's always more requirement than there is funding, somebody has to make a resource allocation decision. And I think what this tries to do is it's giving the PAEs expanded power over the cost, schedule, and performance and the resource allocation decisions. So I think in that regard, it's going to be a fundamental transformation of the way we do business. The bottom line is the Secretary of War wants to go faster. I think this is designed to go faster. And I think it's also because of the way we reorganize some of the people. We've got direct reporting PMs. We've streamlined the acquisition processes. This is also acknowledgement that leadership matters. And if you put the right people in charge and you give them the responsibility for cost, performance, and schedule, you're going to see improvement.
Hey, Sledge, I thought you brought up a really good point. And to Laser's concern about deck chairs, the proof is going to be in the budget. We start seeing resources aligned and to make sure that we've got a commercial first principle and execution, that the PAEs are actually going faster with the budget that they have and executing that. I think then this is an absolutely aligned effort to get after that faster acquisition structure that the Secretary is looking for. If this is not backstopped by an actionable budget that we can see and attribute, I think Congress is going to be all in arms about, hey, this is just another reorganization. Over.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Rolly. The last thing I would say is I think the demise of JSIDs is a little premature here. Remember, you still have to connect a requirement to a procurement action. So the real question of this end master saying, well, we'll see, is whatever results from this structural reorganization, is it better or is it worse? Or is it the status quo? So I guess the jury's out on it.
One thing that was interesting in the acquisition document was that it talked about really focusing on what are the operational problems that you're trying to solve. I mean, having seen requirements from an industrial perspective, it is very prescriptive over the type of technology that they're looking for. The service has already decided what kind of technology they want, and they know exactly the beeps and squeaks and speeds and Gs and all of that they want. So it's very prescriptive and basically turns that program into a commodity as opposed to unleashing the creativity of industry where you say, I have a problem, go solve it for me. And seeing the variety of capabilities that industry is able to bring and the different types of solutions they bring based off of how creative their engineers are, what the particular strengths of that company are, et cetera. So although I do think that we need to make sure that we're smart about not throwing all requirements away, because we still need to be interoperable, we still need to have certain reliability rates and things like that, I'm excited to see that they're going to focus more on the problem and how industry can unleash their creativity there. So, keeping on line with this whole notion of the industrial base, General Deptula, what are your takeaways regarding how Secretary of War Hegseth has been pushing for changes?
Well, my main takeaway is that this is a necessary course correction. And guess what? It's long overdue. For years, decades, the Department of the Air Force has been trying to execute 21st century competition with 20th century acquisition processes while expecting an industrial base optimized for efficiency to suddenly deliver wartime capacity. That gap is no longer tolerable. What's encouraging about this round of program management and acquisition reform is the emphasis on speed, accountability, and scale. The focus on shorter decision timelines, clearer program ownership, and fewer handoffs directly addresses one of the Air Force's biggest problems. And that's that programs take so long to field that relevance erodes before capability arrives. So Secretary Hegseth's push on the industrial base is especially important. Deterrence today depends on as much on production capacity, munitions, spares, propulsion, repairables, as it does on highly capable combat aircraft. Industry will respond, but like we said earlier, only if it sees stable multi-year demand signals and contracting mechanisms that reward delivery at scale rather than compliance with process. That said, reform has to go beyond policy memos. Success is going to be measured by whether these changes actually result in faster fielding, higher production rates, and improved readiness. If the workforce isn't empowered to take informed risk, if test and certification timelines don't compress, and if Congress isn't aligned on multi-year funding, then the impact will be limited. So, bottom line, the direction is right. Aligning Air Force acquisition reform with a serious effort to rebuild the defense industrial base is exactly what's required. Now the hard part begins, turning intent into sustained execution that delivers more combat power faster.
Well, and I would say we can't get that sustained execution if we don't get the dollars. So we've got to be able to get OMB on board with releasing the resources necessary to be able to be able to execute these reforms. So
your intent is right. We'll never get OMB on board, so they need to be gone around, and that's what the president's doing.
So, Dahm, give us some context regarding how China is moving forward with their production trends, because you and I have talked a lot about this, and it is worrisome.
Yeah, and I could go on for quite some time. I'll try to keep it short, especially after my last diatribe on the national defense strategy. But the bottom line is the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and especially the People's Liberation Army Air Force, or the PLAF, has benefited from these multi-year reliable demand signals that they've gotten from their government. They haven't turned on a dime, but for several years they have been building up to a really stunning capacity for producing combat aircraft. So not to put too fine a point on it, but my projections are that by 2028, China is producing 300 4.5 and 5th gen aircraft each and every year. And that could go on for several years. There's a new factory that, again, it didn't just arrive out of thin air.
Well, it pretty much did, because it only took them like 2.5 years to build.
So,
right?
yeah, three years ago, they started clearing land.
And this was a greenfield, not a brownfield, greenfield production capacity.
Well, there were 3 villages there. They raised the villages, moved the people out, started building this new factory. It's 4 million square feet of factory space and like a 15,000-foot runway. And that's probably where they're going to be producing their F-35 knockoff, the J-35, and maybe even some 6th generation types of aircraft. So China has been planning for this for a long time. Meanwhile, we're trying to dig ourselves out of this hole that General Deptula keeps referring to, the smallest, least capable, oldest Air Force.
Well, an important piece of this, you said 2028, they're going to be building upwards of 350 aircraft per year. They will also have replaced every single one of their 3rd generation aircraft.
Absolutely.
So they're going to be a newer more modern force, and they'll then continue to grow.
Yeah, when we make such a big deal out of this 2027 date, like Xi Jinping has ever said that he's going to invade Taiwan by 2027. That's just not true. But 2027 is absolutely a short-term modernization goal that Xi Jinping has set for his force. There's a question of whether they're going to reach it, and that may have had something to do with this General Zhang, of the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, being dismissed last week. But the bottom line is, yeah, the PLA Air Force is working toward that short-term goal in 2027 by replacing all of their third-generation aircraft and then really starting to gain altitude in terms of the numbers of modern fighter aircraft that they can roll off the line and put into their force.
Yeah, so they will have newer aircraft, literally younger, rolling just off the line. Everything's going to be 4.5, fifth, and potentially sixth generation, and they will exceed us in capacity. So they will have more aircraft than we will. And that's pretty sobering when you think about how close 2027, 2028 is.
And just as a preview of coming attractions, just to throw it out there, you heard it here first in February of 2026. If the PLA is, as I predict, going to go expeditionary and increase their military influence around the world, they are going to have the Air Force that is going to allow them to do that. And they are building it right now.
All right, so folks, we're going to close this up with space because there are space topics that we need to address. And one of those is a call in Europe for a European Space Command. Boots, what's up with that?
So the Defense Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, has called for a partnership of space commands. Essentially, he's highlighting right now that the EU countries must seek U.S. permission to share SDA data on threats, and that really slows down their process. And I mean, he's calling it an obstacle to their security and their independence in space. So they're thinking that this level of cooperation could be a key component of their upcoming European Space Defense Shield, and with details to come out later this year. But the general idea is for the European nations to share their national capacities. That will give them more autonomy from the U.S. while at the same time sharing assets and data across the national lines for a common defense of all of Europe.
Interesting. So they're looking at that independent European Space Command. Raleigh Space Force, however, is looking to expand their personnel bench. So bring us up to speed on what's going on there.
Oh, yeah. I think General Deptula referenced it earlier, right? There is not a mission in which the Space Force is not intimately involved. And we look at a historically small service with a disproportionately large effects and the threat environment only expanding. And so I think the BCSO has been pretty adamant in recent forums about articulating how the Space Force needs to evolve, both from a mission maturation perspective, but also the number of guardians that are supporting those missions. And I think that is something that as this initiative was undertook to get to a flat Space Force, that was righteous in its time, but as we expand the missions and utility and warfighting capabilities of our Space Force, those numbers are going to have to increase to match the capability required for what we're being called to and asked to do.
Yeah, no, exactly. We're giving more missions to the Space Force. We're demanding more of them. So we've got to have the Guardians available to execute that. Now, the transport layer was restored in the FY26 appropriations bill. Can you explain to our listeners what that transport layer means and why is that development important?
In general terms, the PWSA, the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture that SDA it has been building out is essentially made of two constructs, the tracking layer and the transport layer. In this particular budget, the transport layer, through some of the congressional marks, was starting to get decremented, and there were some concerns about its utility, given some of the MILNET investments that the Space Force had requested, both in their budget and in their unfunded list. And so I think what we see here is a recommitment by the appropriators to make sure that the transport layer is funded and articulated in a way that is important. And I think as you look at the joint explanatory statement, it's within one of the SDA lines is a $50 million ad for what they call the program increase for warfighter-centric capability. That is a veiled and sort of explained reference in the explanatory statement to the transport layer. And so all of these things, as you start to get into a real combined communications and tracking architecture between missile warning, missile track, what's coming with whatever becomes of MILNET, which there were some really significant moves on the MILNET and efforts that are all, I think, interrelated. And so it'll be really interesting to see how all of this matures and is articulated in the 27 budget request.
So, Raleigh, you had just mentioned that the transport and the tracking layer are really connected, but the GAO just reported that SDA has got to be more realistic about those risks in that satellite tracking effort. What's going on there?
I think GAO traditionally looks at how things are costed out and how things are planned out. And so they took some issues with how the Space Development Agency is evaluating TRL levels and the process by which they are evaluating and incorporating that into their cost structures moving forward. And I think that's a realistic sort of evaluation and critique, but I think it's also the SDA has said they disagree with some of the premises and assumptions that went into that. And so I think there's going to be a natural back and forth. It's good that SDA has a lot of attention on it. It's one of the most funded and well-funded programs within our space architecture. And it deserves to be, evaluated fairly. And certainly the appropriators are going to be paying a lot of attention into, how these respective tranches roll out and the costing and the variables that are going into that. One of the things that's addressed in there is even some of the costing that went into the ground segment materials and how they're evaluating capability in the contracts that they're awarding for ground. And so I think it's good to pay attention to this, but it's certainly going to be additive to the discussion as we get into 27.
It's really interesting. And we've been talking about how much mission is being required of the Space Force, and that's going to require more satellites, more constellations. But Boots, we're also seeing reports that we've got a real launch congestion problem. So how do we reconcile the demand for more space when we don't have enough launch?
So it's like the old trope says, I got good news and I got bad news. So the good news is that our launch sector is absolutely booming. The U.S. is the preeminent launch provider the world over. And that has lessened the cost of launch, and that has made new proliferated constellations that we're talking about possible, and space launch available for a much greater participation than ever before. I mean, it's truly tremendous. But the bad news is you can only launch so much at once with the infrastructure that we have, and we are starting to cap out. Space launch is still a delicate process. Truly, it's the most vulnerable a payload will ever be in its lifetime. There are so many considerations for range safety and safety of flight and timing considerations for testing and rehearsals. There are environmental considerations. There's a lot. And we're seeing launches getting put on manifests later and later due simply to congestion. So here are some numbers to share with you. Vandenberg saw 71 space and test launches last year. It's the highest launch rate since the 70s. The Cape saw 109 launches in 25, breaking their 2024 record by 16 launches. Wow. Truly is unprecedented. Now, the Space Force is tracking this, though, obviously, and they are recognizing that the congestion is a real thing. They're looking for ways to ease it. They have a concept called Spaceport 2036, and they're looking to invest more than $860 million for expansion at Vandenberg, including some new actual launch towers. It's going to be very exciting. There's always a buzz, and certainly more right now, about the need to expand Canaveral. And NASA is actually looking to increase launch capacity at one of our other launch sites, normally for smaller stuff at Wallops Island, and that's in Virginia. So they know, they're looking at it, and they're seeing what we can do.
Now, so a lot of this is being driven by commercial launches as well, right?
Absolutely.
So how come we're not using other locations like New Mexico or Texas or Colorado? Are those sites being limited by airspace, by infrastructure, by the launch dynamics and geometry for the orbits that are needed?
Well, it's actually all of that. It's all of it. I mean, your intuitions are spot on. And so to look at a new launch site, safety, of course, is one big reason that launch locations are where they are, right? Launching over the water is much safer, and then launching over populated areas. Certainly, the launch geometry is very important for orbital geometry and the efficiency and the how efficient can we be with fuel, which relates to cost then. And so having an ideal location depending on the orbit that the asset will be in ultimately is very important as well. So all of that comes into looking at it. It's a very complicated process. And certainly we've seen SpaceX with their newer site down in Boca Chica, right? They were able to pull all of that together. And so SpaceX has a number of launches that happen in South Texas. But I don't know that most of our spacefaring companies have the capacity or
the
truly
CapEx,
money
right?
to be able to have their own launch sites, right?
Interesting. Well, I know that's something that we're going to have to wrap our arms around, especially as not only do we have an increased demand for space launch, but if we want to get into those dynamic space operations, like what Charles wrote about, we're going to absolutely have to address that demand signal. So we are
just to tap onto that real quick before we close. Congress is even weighing in here with the appropriations. In FY26, the Space Force is responsible to provide a 5-year strategy for launch infrastructure, right? Cadence is a commodity when it comes to launch, and our leaders are certainly looking at our launch infrastructure as being vitally important. So that's in the 26 joint explanatory statement again. So a lot of precedence and preference to get this sorted out.
excellent. Well, that's good news. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate y'all being here.
Thanks, everybody.
This is fabulous.
Okay, Heather, have a great Air and Space Power kind of day.
Thanks, Heather.
See you next time.
All right. Hey, great to be with everybody and enjoy another 6 weeks of winter.
All right. And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time.